version in place at the time of the meeting, correct?
I would have.
Okay. That wasn't your council established before. That wasn't your intent to use a subsequent policy. Okay. If I understand your prior testimony correctly, you said that the subject of an investigation does not have the same affirmative duty to explain themselves as a witness. Is that your testimony?
Yeah, I said it was different. The witness and the subject of the investigation is different as far as just answering questions.
What policy in the Scottsdale Police Department says that?
It doesn't.
Okay. What training have you been to for the Scottsdale Police Department that says that?
None.
Is there anything in writing besides your statement or the transcripts in this case that would have established that the subject of an investigation has a different standard than the witness of an investigation?
Say a little bit louder, speak, please.
I'm sorry. Is there anything that we could see in writing besides transcripts in this case that would establish that the subject of an investigation has a different standard to answer questions than the witness of the investigation?
The NOI is different, but I don't think what you're referring is you would find anything like that.
Well, the NOI is actually less extensive for a witness than it is for a subject, right?
Or it's more general.
Okay. And it does not include an additional affirmative duty compared to the subject NOI, correct?
Maybe I don't understand the affirmative duty. Could you explain that, please?
Sure. The witness NOI does not say anything about expanding your answers beyond what's asked, correct?
No, just our policy.
Okay. And the policy makes no distinction between witnesses and subjects.
That's correct.
So we can't look to the NOI to expand that, right?
Correct.
Okay. But ultimately, everyone involved in an IA investigation has an obligation to answer questions fully, correct?
Yes.
Everyone involved in an IA investigation has a duty to provide pertinent facts to investigators, correct?
Yes.
Okay. Now, I want to make sure that I understand a fundamental basis of your investigation. Ultimately, you sustained misconduct based upon a finding that minor engaged in intentional misconduct, correct?
Yes.
So if there was an omission that was accidental, that wouldn't qualify as discipline, right?
Well, I have nothing to do with discipline.
Okay. If there was an omission that was accidental, that would not support a finding of misconduct, correct?
Yeah, if it was adequately explained or if they said that.
Okay. So I'm going to walk back through the chronology of what occurred, and let's talk about where misconduct exists. So at the Patrol Division staff meeting, Chief Slavin made multiple inappropriate remarks, correct?
Yes, correct.
And that is misconduct, right?
Yes.
And everyone at that meeting had an obligation to report that misconduct, correct?
Yes.
Okay. And you now know that Commander Minor did report this misconduct to Assistant Chief Pop, correct?
Yes.
And that was appropriate for Commander Minor to do?
Oh, yes.
Okay. And then you now know that Chief Pop reported this misconduct to Chief Rodbell, correct?
I don't know that.
You have no way of knowing whether Chief Pop told Chief Rodbell that there was a report?
I'm not sure if he told them. I have to go back to my report and what Chief Pop said. I'm sorry, I don't know if he did or not.
That wasn't a factor that you considered in making your finding?
That Chief Pop told Chief Rodbell about it?
Yes.
No.
Okay. And it wasn't a factor in your report that Chief Rodbell knew that Commander Minor had brought misconduct forward?
I didn't know Chief Rodbell knew it.
Okay. Because you never interviewed Chief Rodbell, right?
That's correct.
Now, let me ask you this. If Chief Slavin had mischaracterized his comments at the meeting to Chief Rodbell, would that be misconduct on Chief Slavin's part?
Depends upon the facts and circumstances.
Okay.
Any comment.
Okay, so if he intentionally downplayed the comments that he made, if Chief Slavin intentionally downplayed Chief Slavin's comments to Chief Rodbell, would that be misconduct?
Depends. Could be.
Okay. Do we know whether that occurred?
No.
Was that something that you investigated?
No.
Okay. But we do know, you did say that Chief Slavin reported this misconduct to Chief Rodbell, right?
Yes.
And Damian Mendoza brought misconduct to Chief Rodbell's attention too, correct?
Correct.
And this initially occurred verbally in a meeting?
Yes.
And then at that point, Chief Rodbell said that he would do nothing further because he'd already issued a verbal counseling, correct?
Object to that issue.
I don't know.
Okay. So no one ever told you that Chief Rodwell said that nothing further is going to happen?
I've never heard nothing further is gonna happen.
Okay. Now, at the end,
Excuse me. More words to that effect? No, NFA, I see. No further
I
action.
don't recall
Okay,
anything
just want
like
to make
that.
sure
I'm
it's,
sorry.
you don't know the results of the investigation. You don't know what happened with regard to Assistant Chief Slavin as a result of your investigation. Is that your testimony?
I know what happened to Assistant Chief State, yeah, based on the discipline, but we're referring back to the initial part of
Okay,
it.
then that was my confusion, I apologize.
okay. I want to know if you have any information as to whether Chief Rodwell told Damian Mendoza, I've already verbally counseled Chief Slavin, nothing's going to happen further to him. And or words to those effect, to be fair.
Yeah, I don't have, that doesn't sound familiar to me, I'm sorry, I don't know that.
Okay. Now, at some point, if I'm correct, Chief Slavin got a verbal reprimand, right?
He did, for verbal counseling, not reprimand.
Verbal counseling, thank you. When did that verbal counseling occur?
I don't know.
Okay. When did the paperwork related to that verbal counseling occur?
The only paperwork that I saw where it said verbal counseling is when the chief signed off on the final disposition of the case.
After your investigation.
That's after my investigation.
So prior to the initial IA investigation, you're not aware of any paperwork that would have memorialized the verbal counseling received by Chief Slavin,
I haven't
correct?
seen anything like that.
Okay. Now, it's your understanding that Damian Mendoza was told to put his concern about Chief Slavin's comments in writing, right?
I don't know if it was writing, but make it formal, so I assume that would have been an email in writing.
Is that a requirement of AR 333?
No,
Okay. Now, does AR 333 require the issues be brought to Human Resources? Not the person who made the inappropriate remark, right?
yes,
Okay. Did you document that in your investigation?
that document what?
That Commander Minor had followed that part of AR 333?
I didn't write that he followed that part of AR 333.
Okay. And you don't know whether actually you do know, eventually. So Chief Pop did actually bring this AR 333 concern to Chief Rodwell, correct?
I don't know that. I have to check my report to see if he told me that.
Yeah.
I would imagine he did, but I have to check my report.
Well, I mean, again, we're talking chronologically, not what you found out when, but we're talking about what actually happened in this event. Chief Pop brought Commander Minor's concern to Chief Rodwell, correct?
No, I don't know that is what I'm saying.
Okay. Well, the record talks about Chief Pop's interview, and we'll talk to him later, so I'll come back if you don't remember. If anyone retaliated against the people that brought issues forward, then they would be violating AR 333, correct?
Part one, yeah.
Okay. And it was appropriate for Bonnet to bring his concerns to Commander Minor, right?
Yes.
And it was appropriate for Commander Minor to bring his concerns to Chief Pop, right?
Yes.
And it is appropriate for Chief Pop to bring his concerns to Chief Rodwell, correct?
Yes.
And eventually you learned that Pop told Commander Minor that Rodwell had already, quote, handled this matter,
That
right?
sounds right.
Okay. Commander Minor also told you that in his conversation with Slavin said that Slavin learned that he could not let his hair down at Patrol Division staff meetings. Do you recall Commander Minor telling you that?
I recall that phrase, I just don't know if it was Commander Minor who told me that or if it was someone else.
Well, did you ask Chief Slavin about that comment?
About letting his hair down?
Yeah.
No.
Okay. You didn't think it was important?
I don't know what Commander Minor told me or someone else told me. But letting your hair down would not be a question I'd ask.
Okay. Now, in your investigation, you know that Chief Slavin was told that there were unknown people who had attended the meeting and were offended by Chief Slavin's comments, right?
I'm sorry, one more time.
Sure. So you know that Chief Slavin had been told that there were unknown people who had attended the meeting and were offended by Chief Slavin's comments, correct?
Yes,
And Chief Slavin learned that information from Lieutenant Smith, right?
correct.
And you said one of the points of your IA interview was to find the people that were offended, right?
Yes,
Why didn't you ask Lieutenant Smith that question?
that if he was offended,
No, if he knew who was offended at the meeting.
I think when I got to the part of, I knew I was going to talk to everybody, and after I didn't get that information from Commander Minor, I went to closed-end questions to try to figure out specifically about themselves.
So Commander Minor was this tipping point. He's the only one that needed to point you in the right direction, and then everybody else you just asked about their own impressions? Is that your testimony?
Is that my testimony? No, that's not my testimony. My testimony is that Commander Minor didn't tell me enough to go forward with anything.
What about
I'm sorry.
No, I interrupted you. Go ahead.
No.
Well, you knew you talked to Chief Slavin first, right?
Yes,
So the discipline notice says that Commander Minor was the first person interviewed. Chief Slavin was actually the first person interviewed, right?
we don't have a discipline notice. The case says, yeah, I said that I talked to Chief Slavin before Commander Minor.
Okay. And Chief Slavin had given you the name of this person who had heard concerns that were relayed to Chief Slavin, right?
Are you talking about Lieutenant Smith?
I'm talking about Lieutenant Smith.
Okay, yes, I think that's in what he said.
But you didn't want to know who talked to Lieutenant Smith about those concerns?
Did it occur to me?
Okay. So let's talk about your preparation for this interview. Did you do your normal preparation prior to your interview with Commander Minor?
Everything's different. Every case is different. It's fluid. So normal is probably not, other than looking at policy.
Okay. So you don't normally have an outline or prepared questions prior to going into an IA?
Sometimes I do, sometimes I don't.
Just as a reminder, and I'll try to do the same thing. This is eventually going to be taken down by a court reporter who's going to try to get both of our testimonies at the same time.
I'll wait for you to finish.
Yeah, it's very important that, and I'll try to do the same to you, but it's very important that we don't talk over each other. My question was, did you have an outline? Do you normally prepare an outline or questioning? And your answer is sometimes?
It's, sometimes I do, sometimes I don't. It depends on the case. Short form stuff, I don't. Small stuff, bigger stuff, I usually do.
And you considered Commander Minor's interview to be a short form thing?
No,
Okay. You considered Commander Minor's interview to be not a big thing?
no, I think it's a big thing.
Okay. Then why didn't you prepare outlines of questions prior to his interview?
I think I had something written down, but I didn't do something on the computer. I don't know what he had in front of me.
Okay. Was the purpose of the IA interview to figure out what happened at the meeting?
It was to figure out what happened at the meeting, yes. It was, I was gathering basic facts, still gathering facts.
Okay. So you were trying to gather as much information as possible?
Yes,
And you were trying to investigate an allegation of misconduct and find an offended party?
I was trying to find out who was offended and if there were offended parties so I could talk to them and help them, yes.
Okay.
And, sorry, first part of yes, investigate misconduct.
And by help them, all you're talking about is giving them that cathartic moment to have an interview?
Oh, no. There are people who come to us who are very emotional, and we've called HR in, and we've got them help.
Okay. Did you do that for anybody in this case?
No,
Okay. So, Minor did say that the statements were on their face offensive, correct?
I think he said it's added space, they're offensive, but yes, the center's the same.
Something to that effect? So, you took that to mean that he was minimizing the conduct?
That added space, no, that doesn't minimize it.
Okay. But overall, you take his interview to minimize the conduct of Chief Slavin? That's your testimony?
Yeah,
Okay. You told Minor that you'd be interviewing everybody else present at the meeting, right?
Correct.
And you asked if anyone was directly offended, correct?
Yeah, if he knew anybody else that was directly offended.
Okay. And he had just talked about the concept of the homophobic remark being directed to a specific person, right?
Right.
So he's actually the first person to use this directed word, right? And he used it to describe Lieutenant Myers, correct?
I'll have to look at that. I'm sorry. I don't know if he's the first one to use it. If I used it or he used it.
Okay. Why did you include that word directly?
If a comment was made, did it affect them directly versus it affects all these people?
Okay, why not ask, was anybody offended by the comment?
Maybe it's because of the way I speak, but it was broad enough for everybody to understand. I think it was perfectly fine.
And you think that directly offended also would include anyone who is indirectly offended, correct?
Yep.
You wrote that in your report. Directly offended can also mean indirectly offended.
Or specifically offended or offended.
Okay. So you think the word directly means nothing in the course of that question?
Well, I think the distinction without a difference.
What's the distinction?
That, like I just said a second ago, that the comments affected that person directly. He talked about people looked like they had a concern, but there's no one in particular that stood out.
Yeah, we're going to talk about the people that had a concern later. Why is this question of whether anyone was directly offended relevant to determining if a policy violation occurred?
Directly offended isn't relative to policy. It's related to if someone's offended, so I can get to them sooner to help them.
Okay.
Counsel, I apologize for interrupting. This gives rise to the statement I made earlier, that if we're talking about a transcript, a statement of transcript, I say that to you also, sir, it'd be best to put the transcript in front of the person. Because what he said was, I asked him if someone else was offended. It was a couple minutes ago, I apologize because I wanted to check the transcript. There was two questions actually. We were,
Yeah, and it's on appellant's notebooks, Exhibit 10, and then that serial Bates number on the left side, pages 40 to 44. And just because my notes track the iPad,
okay, that's fine.
I'll give you the double.
The benefit of the board. Just wanted to discuss that.
I'm sorry, I'm not that.
If you use the magnifying glass on the top, then you can type in
Okay, I'm at
page.
page 40 if you need to know.
Okay. Well, you can refer to it if you need to. I'm actually going to move on to a different subject, but if we come back to that, we'll for sure go back to it. So, sir, it's your job to make sure that the information in your report is correct, right?
Yes.
Is there anything in your report that you knew or know now is factually incorrect?
I don't think so.
Okay. After significant interviews, you actually go back to the chief's office as a matter of practice and give a verbal briefing to them as to your findings, correct?
Typically.
Did you do that here?
I'm sure I did.
Okay. But we know now that Chief Rodbell already knew that Commander Minor and Lieutenant Bonnet had an issue with what Chief Slavin said, right?
I'm sorry, I don't know what that, I don't understand your question.
So chronologically, your interview happened, and I'm not trying to hold you to a specific date. This is just generally, like 7 weeks after the meeting
When my investigation started?
is when your investigation.
I think that's about right.
Okay. Or at least your interview with Commander Minor, right?
Yes.
Now, approximately 6 to 7 weeks earlier, we know now that Commander Minor had relayed concerns through his chain of command to Chief Rodbell about what occurred at that meeting, right?
I only knew that it went to Chief Pop. I don't think I knew that it had gone to, at the time, that's all I knew, I think.
Okay. Does Chief Pop typically, in your experience, brief Chief Rodbell on pertinent investigations?
Yes.
Okay. We also know that Chief Slavin had relayed that a different supervisor, Lieutenant Smith, had already said that there were people who were offended, right?
To Chief Slavin, yes.
So, at this point, what information did Rodbell not have in your briefing about what Commander
this point where? I don't know what you're referring to.
Well, I'm trying to take a global look as to what actually occurred. So we know now that Commander Minor had reported information up his chain of command. What new information was to be gained from Commander Minor's interview with you?
I don't know, sometimes you uncover stuff as you move forward.
Okay. Well, let me take one step back. So after you went off tape, and before you went to presumably brief the chiefs, Commander Minor told you that there was another issue that he was willing to discuss on the record. He's willing to go back on tape, right?
I don't know anything about that.
Okay. So Commander Minor had said, you don't recall Commander Minor saying that he had reported this and that he was told that Rod Bell would handle it?
I don't recall that at all.
Okay. And you don't recall an offer of Commander Minor to go back on tape if you wanted to discuss those issues?
No, I don't recall that at all.
You saying it didn't happen?
No, I just don't recall. I think we had a conversation afterwards, but I don't recall anything like that.
And so you don't know one way or another whether Commander Minor offered to go back on tape to give you more information?
Yeah, that's correct. The only thing I remember him saying is something about Chief Bravo being a CEO. That's the only thing that sticks in my mind.
And you don't remember a conversation about Commander Minor's willing to talk on tape about how Chief Rod Bell handled the investigation? That's your testimony?
I do not remember anything like that.
Do you deny that happened?
No, like I just said, I don't remember it.
Okay. Let's assume that that happened. Should you have gone back on tape?
Give me what he said again, please.
If you want to know other information about what I reported and how Chief Rod Bell handled this situation, I'm willing to go back on tape.
Yeah, that's what he did on tape.
Okay. And you don't know one way or another whether that occurred?
Whether he talked to me about it?
Yes.
No, I don't know, and I've answered that already.
Okay. So it may have happened, you just don't recall.
Right,
But if it did happen, you should have recorded it. You should have gone back on tape.
yes.
Okay. So later you interviewed other people that were at the meeting. Some of them said that no inappropriate statements occurred, right?
I don't recall that. I think people said they didn't hear something. I don't remember anybody saying no inappropriate statements.
Okay.
I'd have to look.
You didn't ask any of those other people if they were directly offended, right?
I'd have to look. I don't know.
Okay.
But obviously my report stands for itself.
And you didn't ask any of those who remembered the statements if they reported the misconduct to anyone else, right?
Right.
But isn't that a policy violation to fail to at least bring this issue to their respective chain of commands?
It can be.
So why didn't you investigate that policy violation?
Because I had a scope of the investigation, that's what I was sticking to. Sometimes when we put forward the case, if there's other misconduct, which happens quite frequently in a case,